uninterrupted time and space to share their insights with us based on their community, decades-long community activism. I thank the Women and Gender Studies Institute and the Department of Sociology, in particular, Elisa Trotz, Melissa Milky, Joe Saliba, Natalia Malak, Melissa Begin for making this gathering possible. And of course, our panelists and all of you who came today. 오늘 이 자리에 함께 해주셔서 진심으로 감사드립니다. Before we begin, let us open with land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Yeon Choo. Thanks for segueing into that. We begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. On Indigenous lands and shores of the planet's largest gathering of fresh water. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. Today, the meeting place of Takaranto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in and enter into respectful and caring relations in community on this territory. And in the spirit of acknowledgement, before we begin our proceedings, we would like to have a moment of silence for the shootings of the victims of the Atlanta shootings, as Yeon and I note their names.
Hyunjung Grant, 51 years old. Sunja Kim, 69 years old. Soonjung Park, 74 years old. Younghae Yu, 63 years old.
Xiaoji Tan, 49 years old. Dao Yu Feng, 44 years old. Delana Ashley Yeon, 33 years old. And Paul Andre Michaels, 54 years old.
Thank you. When Robert and I were preparing for this gathering today, we gave the name Anti-Asian Racism and Intersectional Violence. In the wake of the Atlanta shootings, we thought it was important for us to name and acknowledge the anti-Asian racism and its violence. As scholars and as Asian immigrants ourselves, we know firsthand how devastating the rise of anti-Asian violence and hate was in the past year for us under the pandemic. And it really did not need a mass shooting for people to see that. We also know as scholars that it did not come from out of nowhere. It is in fact embedded in this colonial history that treated Asians as perpetually foreigner, who do not belong, but whose labor is very much needed. We also want to bring attention to the intersectional forms of anti-Asian racism that is not just a matter of race versus gender, race or gender, but it is racism that takes the form of gender-based violence, dehumanization of sex workers, labor exploitation, and exclusion of immigrants. However, I think if we were to give the name of the event today, I think we would have probably called it Anti-Asian Racism and Intersectional Resistance, because that is the story we want to highlight. The violence is crucial, but so is the collective efforts that all these amazing community organizations have been struggling to fight for this issue. So in that spirit, I hope we can bring our full attention and really learn from these very experienced panelists today.
Thank you, Yeon. I wrote something, and so I'll just read it very briefly. Empathy is a crucial element to mourning and militancy. To empathize with someone is to share in their feelings, hopes, and dreams. It is to take the time to imagine a life that may be different from yours, but is no less valuable nor important. As I reflect on the shootings in Atlanta and the anti-Asian racism it represents, I'm reminded of the need to return to empathy as we learn about the everyday lives of Asian women who were put in harm's way and were ultimately taken from their families, friends, and loved ones. Sun-Sha Kim migrated to the United States from Seoul. She worked 2 to 3 jobs to provide for her family, despite little fluency in English, according to her granddaughter, Regina Song. Young Yu loved Korean food and karaoke, according to her son, Rob Pete. Her Sunday routine at the grocery store became an opportunity for the family to bond as they prepared for a home-cooked Korean meal. Hyunjung Grant, whose maiden name is Kim, was an elementary school teacher in South Korea before moving to the United States. She liked dancing and partying and often had the vibrancy of a teenager, according to her son, Randy Park. She was also a single mother who worked hard to support her 2 sons who saw her as their best friend. As I tell these stories about the shootings victims through the eyes of their grieving kin, I'm mindful of the painful realization that for some of the victims like Dayu Feng, there have been no kin who've publicly shared her story. But the life Feng lived is no less valuable nor less deserving of our collective mourning. The lack of public stories about Feng calls on us to reflect on the meaning of empathy now, as we are surrounded by and take for granted the stories of Asians living in Canada who must negotiate experiences with precarity daily and whose narratives are rarely told, prioritized, or imagined. For me, this personal desire to learn about the story of others and the need to empathize with them is something that is inescapable. I work at a university where I am one of 2 Filipino faculty members in the entire humanities and social sciences, even as I live in a city where most people who look like me work in care work, service work, and frontline retail work. I'm reminded of this empathy when I hear from Filipino students who often do not discuss the challenges their mothers face as caregivers until I ask, and whose belief in themselves are often intricately tied to a broader institutional context that rarely addresses the diaspora's rich histories. I'm reminded of this empathy as I encounter the struggles and strengths of queer, trans, and non-gender conforming Filipinos who must do so while who experience professionalization upon their migration and must do so while dealing with explicit homophobia and transphobia. To me, empathy cannot only mean mourning. Empathy must also become militancy. It must become a demand for social change in the form of material support for organizations like ACAS, Butterfly, Chinese Canadian National Council, Asian Canadian Labor Alliance, and other community groups which have increasingly been unable to secure the needed funding to help marginalized folks. It must also become a desire to alleviate the barriers that affect Asian, Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ, and differently abled communities, since anti-Asian racism will only foster if we deny ourselves the empathy to humanize and better the lives lived by others despite such dehumanization. So as I animate this empathy today, I look forward to learning from and being with and in conversation with community leaders who've done the important work of demanding the change for marginalized Asian communities and empathizing with their plight. As we learn from their stories, I invite us to encounter them with the empathy that I have invoked, knowing that to mourn and to demand immediate change for the oppressed must always coexist. Thank you. And on that note, we'd like to welcome our speakers, Elene Lam for Butterfly, Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Network, Support Network, Justin Kong, Chinese Canadian National Council, Toronto Chapter, and Rick Sin, Asian Canadian Labor Alliance, Ontario Chapter.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. Could you introduce yourself and your organization for the people here? Justin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Kong, he, him pronouns. I'm the executive director at the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter. And so we're an organization that works with the Chinese Canadian community in the greater Toronto area since 1981. And so, I think that stop there.
Rick?
Hi, my name is Rickson. I teach social work for a living, but I'm here as the co-chair of the Ontario chapter of Asian Canadian Alliance, Labour Alliance, and ACLA was formed in 2000. So we are 21 years old, and we are a group of unionists and also labor activists in the Asian community. So our work is to promote like justice within the labor movement and also in the racialized communities.
You, Elaine?
Hi, I'm Elene. I'm from Butterfly, which is an Asian and migrant sex worker support network. So I'm the founder and also executive director. So this is our 6th year. So actually we will have our art exhibition and also some celebration next month. Hope you can join. So Butterfly is a grassroots organization. We organize and mobilize the people who work in massage parlor and also work in sex industry. We're based in Toronto, but we also reach out the Asian and migrant sex worker in other city in Canada and also in other country. Thank you.
So I wanted to open with a question. So what does the Atlanta tragedy reveal for you or mean to you, given the work that you've done with community members, right, with the organization? Yeah, what does it mean to you or reveal for you? I believe, Justin, you are first.
Oh, I'm first. Okay, yeah. Obviously, I think, it's tremendously tragic, right? And, it's white supremacy and white supremacist attacks are not new to Canada or the United States. And so really, I think for me, like for it to happen to Asian communities is in, I guess, in some ways, what has been really particularly shocking about it, right? And so for me, it's really been learning from folks who organize with those communities, right? Folks like Elene who work directly with massage workers here, right? We know the workers there, the workers who were killed, a number of them were massage workers, right? And so we need to recognize that, there's been ongoing organizing efforts in the community to support those workers, right? As there are efforts in different sectors and different areas of work, right? And I think really like upholding that, we have to take our lead from the people who are doing the work and people who are doing the organizing, right? We recognize kind of like, obviously it's important to talk about anti-Asian racism. It's important to talk about like violence, right? But it's also important that, in the conversations that we do center the people who are doing the work and the people who are in the community, right? Rather than, try to like come in and be like, okay, like this thing happened. And so like, how do we like, because there are a lot of like, political opportunism, I think, when we see like the larger picture, right? How do we ground it back into the organizing? How do we ground it back in the community and the community demands? I think that's really important, right? And so, yeah, I'm looking to Elene and, looking to the work that, folks have been doing with massage workers and sex workers. And yeah, and I think, obviously as a community, it's important that we're all standing together and, fighting back against racism, right? And that is good to see. And I'm excited to see that this Sunday, we will have a rally against anti-Asian racism, Nathan Phillips Square, 2 p.m. So come out if you can. And yeah.
I think just like anyone else, personally, I was really like terrified and saddened by the incidents, by the mass killing. But like, to be honest with you, and I wasn't surprised when it happened. And I think in my mind, it was just a matter of time, because like the issues behind the mass murder has been with us for a long time. Like even though like it just happened as a so-called single incident, but like the issues of racism, sexism, and also the failure of our state actually like have been with us and have been affecting the Asian and other racialized community and our indigenous people for like centuries. So, but for the case itself, I myself see it as a textbook case of racism, sexism, and the failure of our state in protecting the most vulnerable populations in this continent. So, and the police may suggest the killer is actually a sex addict, and he might have just a bad day. So, and let's stay on that topic. So, on the topic of sex. So, and it just reminded us how our sisters in the Asian community have been sexualized, have been racially sexualized as passive sexual subjects for people's consumption. So, and the big assumption is like all the workers in those massage parlors are sex workers, and they have to provide sex. And if someone like that killer, so and couldn't get what he wanted, or he couldn't control his own sexual desire, and we have to be victimized by this kind of crazy thought. So that itself actually show us how racism, sexism actually work together that subject our community members to this kind of violence. And I agree with Justin. So this is not just a single incident. This is a tragedy, but it reminds us of all the structural issues have been affecting us and also have been shaping the Asian people in this continent as eternal foreigners, and how this sense of foreigners becomes like the excuse for people to actually vent their grievances or like act upon like the pandemic and victimize us. So especially I believe like coming from the workers' rights point of view, and a lot of people who are under attack are not just Asian. So they are specifically about people who actually work in the meat industry, people who cannot afford to have their own car and they have to ride on TTC, and also the workers who actually work in those spaces like massage parlors and our all those mom and pop stores in our street corners. So that's why like to actually resist, or like what Robert talked about, like our reaction shouldn't be just about grieving or mourning. It's actually about militancy, our resistance. Our resistance has to be about like the combination of racism, sexism, capitalism, and our resistance to colonialism, because like this is not just single incidents. This is a combination of 3 pandemics. So white supremacy, like the COVID-19 pandemic, and also anti-Asian violence. We have to look at them all together in order to really find ways to actually make Canada like really equal for all.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And I think it is great to have chance to have the same panel with Justin and Rick, because they have been a big advocate and supports the butterfly work of organizing and advocating the rights of the massage parlor worker and sex worker. And I think as they said that the killing is not single incident. So that is not something we surprise. So this is not only happened in US, it's also happened in Canada, Ontario, Toronto, Hamilton, Mississauga, Scarborough. Every year we have Asian and migrant workers in massage parlor and sex industry being murdered. But the news is even not being concerned. So, and I think the everyday violence faced by the massage parlor worker and also sex industry is something has been concerning by the committee for a very long time. And when we fight against the racism, it is really great that to see so many people come up, so many people get organized to fight against racism. But we should not forget why they're being murdered, because they are working in massage parlor, because they are being criminalized, they are being over-policing, they are the community being discriminated. So we are really worried that when all the guys fight for anti-racism, again, sex worker and people in massage parlor will be left behind again. Even at the very beginning, they are the target of the violence. In addition of racism, I think we also need to have a very clear message to see they are being murdered is not because they are sex workers. Their murder is not they work in massage parlor. Their murder is because that moral panic, moralistic idea about sexual desire. They are being murdered is because they know that they can have the power over control the people they work in this industry, because they are the people. No one will protect them because the law is targeting them, because the society is discriminating. And I think this is the structural systematic issue we really need to concern, particularly when there is so many concern about the murder, about racism. We hear a lot of call for more protection, more policing. That is really, really make us so worried and afraid, because what makes this community vulnerable actually is policing, actually is the criminalization. The police do not make the community be more safe. Particularly when we talk about racism, we need to acknowledge the intersectionality, classism, migrants, immigration status. So all is the factor make who can be protected, who would not be protected. For migrant sex workers, they are working on the ground. People in massage parlor, the grassroots people do not speak English. They will never get protection. Policing is not the solution. So that's why when there is so many call for respond to hate crime, more police, and that is really extremely worried, that calling for more policing just make people more dangerous. And we also need to know that who are the major violence against the sex worker and massage parlor worker? It's police, it's law enforcement. So later on, I will share the documents so that we have talked to the worker in holistic center, massage parlor in Toronto. What did the law enforcement come in is ask them to take off the clothes, to insult them, to assault them. So this is something we need to know they are not the protector. And then we really call for all the organization and activists. When you talk about anti-racism, you also need to support the anti-policing movement. So the other part we are really worried is many anti-sex worker groups will use this opportunity to call for more rape, because they will blame that because of the sex industry, because people work there, so they are dangerous, then the solution is rape them and eliminate them. I want to say the murder say they want to eliminate this temptation. This is no different with the moralistic group, the religion group, and the anti-sex worker group. I don't call them feminists. Because I really don't think the feminists should love police more than the sex worker. So that they are calling for more rape or eliminate this business is no difference with the murder. They feel they have the power, control over this Asian woman body, that they have power to eliminate them. So I think this is something we also need to concern, and this is something I worry. The third thing I worry is just Rick have mentioned. So there is a lot of discussion about Asian women being sexualized, fetishized, and this is really need to look at it very carefully. And later I will explain a little bit more, because we need to know where it's come from. Is it come from that we are challenged the stereotype of the woman, or is it we come from that actually we also need to know that how Asian community is also affected by Christianity, colonialism, that seeing sex is the sin, seeing sex work is something immoral, that having that hidden agenda to talk about the problem of women being sexualized. Indeed, we also need to acknowledge it. So the sexualization can take away the power of women, but actually many women like sex workers, they also get a lot of power through the sexualization of the woman body. So I think that I may share a little bit more on the anti-racism part, but that is extremely, on the one hand, it's really great to see so much concern, but on this other hand, it's really worry that all concern will left the workers in massage parlor and sex industry behind, and also create more harm to this community already facing extremely policing and criminalization. And one more thing I want to say is not all the people work in massage parlor are sex workers, but we know that the massage parlor workers are being harmed by the criminalization of sex work by the decriminalization of sex work. They are being targeted because not only they are Asian, it's because they are also associated with sex work. So I think that is something we want to share. Thank you.
Thank you both. I just wanted to kind of, say thank you for bringing for us issues, societal issues and structural ones that deal with issues of moralism, the kinds of harms that policing bring. I think, both Rick and Justin have brought up issues of colonialism, but also the kind of ways that Atlanta is not exceptional, right? It's not an exceptional moment. It's like part of a larger struggle and part of a larger history that people might be just learning now, but I think three of you have sort of pointed out that they're present. They're definitely present in the way that our communities are dealing with them, and the kinds of ways that feminism, critiques of capitalism, critiques of policing are some solutions, right, to think through these problems. So thank you, Yeon.
So we all know that this anti-Asian racism is not new. It's not invented because of the COVID. It was there before. And so from your years of activism and community organizing and your organization's work, how does anti-Asian racism look like? Who does it affect? How does it affect the communities you work with and their everyday lives?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, throughout, I guess the best way to talk about that is talk a bit about the work that CCNC Toronto has been doing during the pandemic, right? So basically at the beginning of the pandemic, really, like we were working with grocery store workers in the greater Toronto area, right? And so when the pandemic started, we had an opportunity to work with even more workers in the community, right? Obviously, these were workers who were already marginalized, prior to the pandemic, right? Of course, folks who are working, in the grocery sector, in the food and restaurant sector, and so I think what was really interesting about the pandemic was how all of a sudden these essential workers, they weren't even called essential workers before the pandemic, right? But then all of a sudden, we suddenly recognize that these people actually are the like most important ones in our society because they keep everything functioning, right? Like we can have we don't really need that many real estate agents, but if we don't have enough grocery store workers or people who are caring for our seniors, everything falls apart, right? And so we were really lucky to be able to do that work during the pandemic in the Greater Toronto area with Chinese Canadian workers across a number of different sectors, right? Like food, care work, people who are working in delivery. And so the model really is, how do we organize with workers and support the workers in their own organizing of people in their own sector, right? So that was really interesting, and it was a really great opportunity to learn from the community and build relationships with the community and to support the community directly, right? To reinvest resources back into the community, so that workers can be supporting other workers, and in that process we're doing community building, right? So that's, I think, the racism, when we talk about the racism, obviously a huge part of it is the class component, right? It's like we know that our communities are incredibly complicated, right? And diverse in terms of class, in terms of gender and whatnot, right? So yeah, it's been really trying to focus on that component of the work, right? And so recently we just published a report looking at anti-Asian attacks across Canada, right? And so obviously, with state funding and government funding, there's certain directions that often are pursued, and then there's other directions which are not so strong, which can be strengthened, right? So really for us, it was really how do we have a conversation about race and racism, not just as racist attacks, but really getting at the systemic nature of racism, right? And I think about a lot about there was a viral video of a Chinese worker in a grocery store in the middle of the last year, where he was being attacked basically by this white man who went into a Chinese grocery store and refused to wear the mask, right? And so it was for me, it was I think those are in so many ways the untold stories of this pandemic, right? the experiences of those workers, they're not going to report that, unless that is filmed, that type of stuff is not getting reported, right? And so hopefully, like, our platform really aims to, broaden that a bit so that more folks can share their experiences. But really, I think it's a recognition that, that those workers are the ones who are, like, when we talk about racism, like, we have to center it on their experiences, right? When we're fighting against racism, we're fighting, like, from that perspective, right? Obviously, like, it's bad that, if we're academics and, in university, we're workers too, right? And we face racism as grad students, as whatnot, right? Like, obviously all of these things happen, right? But how do we center it on the experiences of, like, the masses of people who are working throughout the pandemic, right? And so we're coming out of a report that kind of it's surveys, and it's a survey, and it's also interviews with a dozen of our the frontline workers we've been working very closely with during the pandemic. And so we're coming out with that report in May. I'm very excited to share it with you all. It will profile their experiences, and also it contains a survey of about a few hundred, Chinese Canadian workers around the Greater Toronto area, and how they understand, the pandemic, what their experience was like, and also, like, what their political positions are, right? And so I think, I think, as we move towards, talking more about racism, like, how do we ground that discussion with a strong, gender class analysis is really important, right? And how do we make sure, the discussion is ultimately about building power, right? How do we build power in the community? How do we support power building in the community? I think that's really, really key. And so I think if there's one thing for me that I really sits with me during this pandemic, is, like, what does it mean to respect labor, right? In all the diverse ways of labor, as Elene and Rick have mentioned, right? Labor in its diversity, right? And and then what it means to be in a society where labor isn't respected, right? And where labor is, devalued, and, like, it makes no sense to do labor because we can all speculate on Bitcoin, and what kind of, like, I guess, like world that means that we're living in, right? So I think that's what I'm holding in my heart, like, and it's often not easy, right? Like, it's complicated with all these, like, gender, and sometimes it's like this conservatism, whatever, right? Like, it's all messy and it's all complicated. And the only way we work through it is in the community, through really building relationships and working with the people. Working with, like, regular people, right? And so I want to, like, uplift that and, think through further what it means to respect labor and to work through all that messiness to build progressive power, right? I think that's the project of the post-pandemic landscape, right? How do we do that? How do we do that together?
Thank you, Rick. Do you want to continue?
All right. Okay, so I think we are on the same page. We all agree this is not just about racism, and this is actually about intersecting differences and oppressions. So, but in order for us to really deal with the issue, and I want to bring back the issue of racism, because if we really want to look at why Asians being attacked, we have to actually understand how racism operates. So, because like in North America, the whole nation, or the two nations, like America or Canada, actually built on the imagination of the other. So, and for a long time, so, and the way we look at, like, what does it mean by being Canadian? We always talk about multiculturalism, and we might have forgotten. So Canada was actually built on colonialism, and also, like, the racism after that. So, and in the difference between, like, the earlier days of Confederation and the contemporary racism is, like, in the past, racism was actually very blatant. So during the Confederation time, so, like, even official parties could actually have their, like, platform, like, saying keep Canada white only. So, but the difference is now contemporary racism in Canada is about denial of racism. And that force is even stronger than racism itself. So, and that's why when we imagine like what we should do to actually fight against anti-Asian violence, we have to actually look at how the denial being also like perpetuated among us, also within our community. So, and in the past and from the beginning of the pandemic, and I noticed like even in the Asian community, so the first reaction among my friends in the Asian community was, oh yeah, it happened in China. So it's not shouldn't be a problem to call it China virus or even Chinese virus. And my friends from Hong Kong, they even suggested, or maybe half jokingly, on their Facebook, they post T-shirts saying, I am not Chinese, I'm Hong Kongers. So, and that just reminded me of like all those incidents happened in the past. So like the killing of Vincent Chin. So if you are old enough, you remember. So in the 80s, so like of last century. So, and that was actually the time Japanese cars actually coming into the into North America, and the decline of like the auto industry in our continent. And Vincent Chin was targeted not because he was Chinese. He was actually like perceived as Japanese, and he was attacked and he was killed. So, and the same thing about like earlier on when Vancouver, the Chinatown or the Japantown was attacked, not because they are ethnic by ethnic origin. It's actually because we look alike and we are all Asian. So that's why like for us to resist the denial of racism, we have to first like to look beyond multiculturalism, because multiculturalism is actually the excuse for us to actually see us only as cultural communities. And then we fall into the trap of cultural identity. And then we don't see we are actually share in the same space, like in vis-a-vis the white nationalism. And just so happened right now, because of the pandemic, and they have more excuse to target us. And they target us not because we are of cultural belief or cultural heritage. It's actually we look alike. So that's why, like, for us to look at anti-racism or anti-Asian racism, we have to understand how racism operates, and also to resist the denial of racism is the fight that we have to actually gather force, and we have to work with each other. And another concern I have is, so again, in the community, over the last 2 months or so, there were more and more reports in the mainstream media about the attack on the Chinese seniors or the Asian seniors in Auckland, New York, or Toronto, or Vancouver. And then in the media, there are a lot of discussion about, oh yeah, like we have to fight against the Black community, because so happened a lot of those reports were targeting like the Black on Asian violence or attacks. And then they reduce it to like the tensions between Asian and Black community. So, and what they fail to look at is like we are also in the same situation. So pandemic actually impact us very differently and to different degree. And like if we don't see the connection between all other racialized community, we actually miss the point, and we ourselves actually deny the existence of racism. So, and I just want to remind us, so like the founder of Black Panther reminds us, so you cannot fight racism with racism. We have to fight it in solidarity. So that's why, like, if we talk about anti-Asian violence with the intersectional analysis, we also need to look at like what bring us together as racialized community and what kind of racism that we are dealing with. And the denial of racism is as problematic as like racism itself.
Great, thank you so much.
In response to that is, I think it's so true that the solidarity among different community and also how to work together and not divide us is so important. And I think when we talk about racism, particularly the work of Butterfly, we look at the systematic racism and how it is so invisible. The violence is so great, but it's the huge violence, but it's invisible, and how they're being justified. So as I said that sex work is being criminalized and massage parlor is being excessive regulated. So there is a lot of crazy bylaw, including people cannot lock the door, including people cannot get the cash, and like over policing, excessive investigation is responsive the policing of the sex work, right? But when you uncover it, what they are policing the woman's sexuality, but they will not target the white woman workplace at this, because white woman feminist movement is successful to make the people recognize their agency. But the racism against Asian women is being used against this community. And so there is a lot of discussion about Asian women is being sexualized, fetishized, is a kind of like something behind the violence. But I think we really need to acknowledge it's not sexualized itself, because Asian women is also being desexualized, right? At the same time, they're being seen as naive, they are being seen as ignorant. Both actually discourse is being used to justify the subordination, so that like the white people, the men, the intersection of gender and race, that they can subordinate a woman's body. That subordination is not only the men, the subordination also is with the white woman. They can use the name of rescue, to ask for more policing, or like so that no matter you are sexualized or desexualized, so that no matter individual or the state actually have the power over you. Because if you're sexualized, we can see so many rape of massage parlor then, or sex industry, they say they are the social evil, they are endangers the safety of the society. That's something they need to address. But at the end, they try to control the body of the woman, particularly Asian. They know they cannot control the white woman body because they cannot get any success, right? But they are able to do it because they take advantage of the racism. At the other hand, we see so many anti-trafficking organizations. I need to name them. So for example, Defend Dignity in Toronto and Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking, when we were in the City Hall, we have 300 workers went to City Hall say, I'm not traffic victim. And then they say, you're too stupid. You're too naive. You are too victimized. You don't know you're the victim. So that's how the racism played out. And then the city don't listen to this worker, right? Because they are not powerful in this system. Because of the racism, they are not being heard, they are not being acknowledged. Even like one white lady have not connect with any worker in massage parlor. She say, I know women being trafficked in massage parlor. That lead to repressive policy of the massage parlor. We have 300 workers. Tell the city, no, we are not traffic victim. We need to work. They're not being listened. So that's why I think we see how powerful racism play out in so many ways. And particularly, we want to draw the attention of the recent anti-trafficking movement. So many money go to anti-trafficking. I was so surprised when so many folks, activists, they say, I support defund police, I support against criminalization. But when come to the anti-trafficking issue, they will say, oh yes, we need more police, right? And policing for whom, right? Indigenous youth and Asian workers, because they're being assumed that they don't have brain, they cannot protect themselves, they need someone to protect them. And then this rescue regime need police to come in, actually itself is sexist, right? They think that women cannot protect themselves, they need the men come to them. It is racist because they assume that Asian women cannot speak for themselves. And I think that is something we really need to stop the harm of anti-trafficking. Like in Ontario, they just spent $300 million for anti-trafficking organization, and mostly is working, have the religion background, like they are putting the moralistic idea, conflating sex work and trafficking. Again, instead of ending trafficking, they have the very clear mission. They are ending sex work. And Asian is the group they can target because they can make use of this racist assumption of Asian women. So for example, in Ontario, now they are discussing the new anti-trafficking act. So next month, later on, we will have the campaign, hope you support. And in Newmarket and many cities, now is they are trying to changing more bylaw to make the massage parlor is more difficult to operate and also increase more policing. So that is something when you say you stand against racism, it's not only we need to stop the physical attack, we also need to, as Justin keeps saying, that we need to look at who are the most marginalized, vulnerable being attacked. They are vulnerable not because they're vulnerable. They are vulnerable because they're being left behind. So, and when there is so many Asian feminists that they say that sexualized woman body is the problem. I want them to know it's not sexualized itself is problem. It's sexualization provide the power to subordinate woman body. And what we need to support the woman, actually, they can use this sexualization to get the power. We see sex work, and many people actually use the sexualization, fetishization, I don't know how to pronounce this term, fetishization, to gain power, economic resources, get social status, immigration status. This is so powerful. And why we need to stop it, right? So don't use your religion, moralistic agenda over Asian worker work in massage parlor and sex industry. So this is something, if you say you're the activist against sexism, you're the activist against racism, I hope that you will work with us to fight for the rights of the sex worker, to fight for the rights of the woman, that they can do whatever they like, and without this moralistic religion assumption to woman body. Thank you.
Thank you, folks, for, I think you've given us so much to think about, from Justin's response to thinking through labor movements, right? To thinking through, I think Rick really pointed out that the sort of the fault of a kind of thinking about this as exceptional is not to think about the historical moments, from like a violence that exists in the US to like internment to like, that we've like gone through as a community, multiple historical shifts, right? To then Elene's real specific understanding of like the ways that both empowerment and disempowerment, right, around women's bodies are so not only gendered, but actually sexualized in ways that both have completely marginalized them, but actually also we have to pay attention to the way that it's been articulated by them in ways that try to challenge moments of policing, moments of disempowerment, moments the state devalues their experiences, right? And so I kind of wanted to just flag that, because then we're now at another historical moment, that is experienced globally. And, we don't have, you've answered this already briefly in your answers, but we want to give a space for a little bit, and then we can move on to the next question. But if any of you would like to address, like, how has COVID, right, affected, we're now virtually meeting, right, have gone through this for more than a year now. So I was wondering, we were wondering how COVID has exacerbated these issues, shown them to us with clarity, right? What has changed, what has not changed, right? And again, we can move on to the next question, but I thought if there was some space that you wanted to use to think through this, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, I think I spoke a bit about like kind of like the conditions already. I think I think the question, like, I think obviously for a lot of folks that we work with who are workers, low-income workers, migrant workers, workers who are obviously may not have unions or do not have protections in so many ways. It's like recognizing how do we leverage like this moment of like recognizing essential workers, where it's like, like, let's think an essential worker, whatnot. How do we leverage that into actual like real gains for the community, right, and for workers, right? So there's a lot of good groups that are working on these issues. The Migrants Workers Alliance for Change, many different groups that and then certainly we're part of some of these groups as well. Like whether it's status or demands for more, right? Whether that's pay or in terms of how we distribute resources in our society. I think those are looming questions, right? The questions that existed during the pandemic, and there's certainly going to be questions that continue to exist as we move towards the post or like the after vaccines. So how do we come together to build progressive power in our communities is pretty key, right? I think when we think a lot about Chinese and Asian communities, oftentimes we think a lot about like even when I talk to like younger people, right? It's like, why are our communities so like conservative and like it's always conservative, like. And so like the question is, how do we challenge that, right? Because it's not like when we actually go into it, like, and that means sometimes we have to recognize that we can't just like impose our like what our understanding of progressiveness is onto them, right? It has to be a dialogue, right? And we have to commit to building in hard to build communities, right? And so when we do that, when we work with the community, when we build those relationships, I think we're able to, we have to, because if we don't, then we're facing down, collective destruction, right? So how do we build in our communities? How do we not internalize the model minority logics that we may have about our own communities, and commit to building power in our communities, right? And challenging conservatism, challenging certain class interests, and building a broad, like, progressive agenda, right? That can protect our communities, right? Obviously, when we don't, and when as progressives we don't challenge that, we don't engage in our communities, or when we say, oh, it's like, and obviously, like, we recognize that there's a lot of challenges in engaging with our community, right? From the homophobia to the sexism, so on and so forth. These are all, like, things that we have to work through together, right? And obviously we all have different capacities, but I guess for me it's like, the feeling I'm taking into the post vaccine world is I guess the feeling that I've had for a long time is like, how do we build within our communities, right? How do we challenge, contest for power, and how do we build progressive politics that bridges communities, right? Because it's so often that the right wing really, like, seeks to divide us, right? When actually, like, one moment was like, there was a big anti-refugee rally in the Chinese community a few years ago, right? And so it really, like, that was an instance where it's like, okay, clearly there's, like, powerful, like, right-wing political forces here that are taking advantage of our communities and mobilizing our communities in certain ways in which we're not doing, right? We haven't been doing a good job working with our communities. We haven't been mobilizing our communities. And so what happens is, like, the right wing just takes over, right? So I guess if there's something that I want to leave you all with on the, like, post-COVID landscape, is like, how do we commit ourselves to doing the work in our communities? How do we support each other when we're doing that work? And how do we contest for power in our communities, right? And to say, like, no, we're not going to accept this right-wing vision of reality. We're not going to accept austerity. We're not going to accept more policing. We're gonna demand more, and we're gonna fight together to make sure all of us are protected, right? I think that's what I'm holding and what I look forward to being a part of in the future.
I think, like, when we are all in crisis, people actually show their true color. So that's what I get from the pandemic, because, like, the pandemic supposedly actually show us how connected we are. So because the virus actually is colorblind. So, and they don't really see whether you are Chinese or Asian or, like, white or anyone or anyone of any background. So, but unfortunately, like, the true color of people in our country is, so the racial hierarchy, the gender hierarchy, and also the class structure remain intact, which is very, like, obvious. And the pandemic actually show us how, like, people actually affected so differently. So even though our political leaders want us to believe, like, we are all in it together. So, but, like, all these statistics actually show us, like, so in terms of like the virus, and you could see, like, predominantly people of color and also immigrant and people who actually have to actually still work during the pandemic are more likely contracted. So so that means, like, I think the COVID-19 to me is actually like a report card, which is really, like, to show our nation. So what's the current state of our nation, and also, like, what's wrong with it, and then we can ask the question. So what kind of citizenship or Canada as a nation you want to be, you want it to be. So how well we actually take care of our indigenous people, how well we take care of our migrant workers, and how well we take care of the poor in our cities and in across our country. So that's why, like, the COVID-19 is a reality show. So, and I hope we could actually come to the reality and really, like, work together, regardless your racial background. So this is real. So the discrimination, sexism, racism, they all will. They actually affect us. So we cannot get out of it by only the racialized people or by the organizer. So so that's why I think, to me, we could get something out positive out of it. Is we actually look at the report card.
Elene, you're muted.
Elene, I believe you're muted.
Okay, sorry. So I think actually COVID is reflect of the crack of the social system already have. So for example, during COVID, so we have produced a report on how COVID affect the people in massage parlor and also sex industry, so that you can get it like online. So in the pandemic, so despite the government have so many different income support, but most of our member, actually 40% of people is not able to access any income support. First is many of them have a precarious immigration status. Even they work here, but they are not able to get the income support. And some of the people, they are having the immigration status, but because of the criminalization of sex work, they are really worried that the report of the tax will lead to the criminal investigation against them. So, and also like there is a lot of small business, right? People work for small, the sex industry is also small business, but because again, they are not, sex work is not being recognized as work, sex work is being criminalized, they are not able to get like any small business support. And even the people is eligible for everything. I think Justin knows so well how much language barrier, how much this system is used whatever way to exclude you. Particular people do not speak English. So, and I did not go to detail, but like, but whole system, if you don't know English, you're not accessible, you're not familiar with like internet, all these things, you are being excluded, and then you are so traumatized by that process. So this is a powerful way to exclude people. So in addition to income support, like the access of like health, social service is very challenging. So this already challenging because of the language barrier, this because of the precarious immigration status. But during pandemic, is many services being locked down, right? So even Ontario have the policy that now anyone, even without OHIP, can access health service, but it's not true. On the ground, many people still cannot like get any service. And in addition, as I mentioned before, the anti-trafficking campaign is so successful. Many sex worker support projects turn into anti-trafficking investigation project. So that's like before you can go to the drop-in to get shoes, get food, but now when you go there, they will ask you, who are you working with? All these screening questions, surveillance is excluded the people. So because people cannot get support, they do not have income, many people still need to work, right? And the level of policing is crazy. So you know that during pandemic, there is a lot of emergency order, actually increase the power of the police, particularly in Ontario. The law enforcement can get the results of the COVID and access the database. And then and also the police can have the check of your immigration status. So this is not about COVID, right? This is about policing, but they just take this opportunity to police the people. And of course, racialized, criminalized community like Asian sex workers is again being targeted. So in pandemic, so we have a worker work in massage parlor, but her business was shut down because of the emergency order. But because she has she don't feel well, and then her family member, she don't want to infect them, so she stayed in the massage parlor, and she got 5 tickets in 2 days, and the fine is over $10,000. And this is not finished. So now it's the reopen. We know the people in York region, like in 2 days, like 10 massage parlor is receiving so many tickets because they cannot do proper, like what's it called, safety plan, whatever, right? That is also in addition, again, is using this for target. And the normal rate do not stop. When we do not access like any kind of social service support, like government tell you we need to be safe, we don't provide you service, but the police still raid the place. People still being arrested and detained and deported. So massage parlor raid is still happening. People still being ticketed and being fined, being investigated. So that is something really continues faced by the community, and safety again is the huge issue, particularly now it's reopened. And some people is not able to stop working, they're still working, but the safety is again the issue. We have so many workers, when they call police, instead of getting protection, they're being arrested and detained or deported. They're being referred to CBSA, no matter they experience domestic violence at their home or like the workplace violence. And the last piece is also the health. So Butterfly is a member of Migrant Rights Network, so that they we are part of them to fighting for the status for all campaign. So because we really see immigration status is the powerful resistance instead of protection. This immigration status give a lot of power to people. Instead of protection of police, that you take away the criminal law, the people do not feel afraid and they will not be targeted because the perpetrator know that the law does not protect them. And so the other thing we are advocating is the vaccine for all, so that like even in Toronto, they say that the people with the immigration status can get the vaccine, but they still keep requiring the ID. So that is like all structural procedure make people being excluded. Of course, many other cities do not have this policy. So I think, as I said before, COVID reflect the crack of the social system, and this crack is widened in like during this like COVID time, and also racist attack do not stop, and also increasing. Also, same is the people work in massage parlor and sex industry. So that's why I think it's really, really great that at this moment we come together and then to build our solidarity. And as Rick said before, the solidarity is not only with a sex worker community, but also with other migrant, racial justice, and anti-policing, and this different kind of community to fight together and learn from each other. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, I think I just want to say before Yeon asks her final question, we'll be segueing to the Q&A as part of the final question. But I also would like to encourage people to post their questions on Q&A. We've had amazing questions so far. We will try our best to get through them. We might go over time given the number of questions. And so thank you for being patient with us, but also it shows how important this event is. And so for folks who we might not be able to answer the question, we will document them and try our best to think through how to answer them, maybe do another event, do thinking through. I hope that this is not the last one, right? And so before we kind of segue into the Q&A, I just like to encourage people to post comments, questions, thoughts into the Q&A section, and we will let the speakers, the amazing speakers we've had today know. And with that, I'd like to segue to Yeon's question.
Okay, so I have the final question from us. And you've already shared a lot of really amazing campaigns and projects that you've been working on and going on right now. So given the importance of your work, how can we contribute or learn from the community in terms of building solidarity, possibly, across different racial groups, different ethnic groups, connection with anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, and creating tactics for resistance and supporting your goals? What can we do?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think the immediate answer is definitely amplify our voices. You can donate to our organizations. Maybe we can share those links with you all. Share your time with us, right? Share resources with us. I think those are all really concrete ways in which we can, the academic community can support, right? I think there's a larger question about the relation between knowledge production and community organizing and power building, right? Certainly I think given the current landscape of I guess even academic knowledge production and how cutthroat it is, how neoliberal it is, so on and so forth, right? I think there's so many challenges in even conceptualizing how we can do that, right? But I do want to uplift the tremendous work that many women of color and POC within academia are doing, right, in supporting students and supporting young people to learn more about their own histories and get connected with organizing, right? Certainly even for myself, going through sociology at U of T. I had a wonderful mentor in Jennifer Chun, and she tremendously, like, it just opened up opportunities for me, right? So how do we do that as racialized academics? How do we support poor, working class, racialized people in our own institutions, right? I think that's a really big part of a question that we need to ask, and it can't just fall on racialized academics, right? How do we work together to make collective demands for resources, right? Collective demands for power, right? I think those are the questions that I think a lot about, right? Like, how do we respect the labor of teaching assistants and grad workers, right? I think those are things that we need to address, right? I think about my own experience and how racialized working class Asians were faced so many types of abuses within our own system, right? Within our own systems of learning, right? Where we were excluded or mistreated, or abused, right? How do we recognize that those things happen and commit to stopping it at our own institutions, right? I think that is fighting anti-Asian racism as well, right? How do we create spaces for each other? How do we challenge power? How do we work together to take back power? For all our marginalized community, all working communities, and all racialized people, right? So I guess that's the thing that I would put forward, right? Like, obviously, like, as academics, like, y'all have a lot of resources, a lot more resources than we do, right? As poor, community organizers, underpaid, overworked. Elene and Rick are totally overworked. But yeah, so like, how do we like do that commitment work by directing resources? But also, how do we put that into practice within the people that we work with, right? How do we support these young academics or young people who are going through our institutions, right? Because they face so many challenges, right? I know, because I was there, right? And I've seen my peers go through it. How do we support them, right? How do we make sure we're fighting the battle in our own departments, in our own classrooms? I think those are all part of this anti-Asian project, right? And obviously, it's so hard because we're in this neoliberal moment, right? Where we really have to, like, we're always we got to publish, we got to do whatever, right? But how do we, like, the impact that I feel like we can, like, y'all can have as academics is huge, right? On your students and on the people you work with, right? And so hopefully, I feel like, in my work, hopefully I can have somewhat of an impact on the people that I work with, right? And so I recognize all those who have, made way for me and want to commit to also making way for others in the same situation, right? So thank you for inviting us to speak today and giving us this important spotlight. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much.
I have messages for people within the so-called Asian Canadian community and also our potential allies. I think for people in the community, and I really hope we could stay active and be vocal. And just yesterday at CBC Toronto, like Metro Toronto, early in the morning, and I was really concerned about during the interview. The interviewee was someone from the Asian community, and she ended the interview with the emphasis of we Asian socialized not to speak up. So, and I think this is totally like misleading, because if you look at like all those battles within the Canadian history, and also like people who are fighting really, really hard, and even some of them lost their life in Myanmar, Hong Kong, Thailand, all those actually show us Asian could actually be as militant as anyone else. So I think this kind of cultural narrative actually really like problematic. So I think I will invite people in the Asian community to really interrogate this kind of reductionist cultural narratives and stay active, because by staying active and be vocal, we are telling people we Asian they are here, and we actually care about our rights, and we will also act upon our rights. And for people who are not in our community, and I hope you could actually look at how much you could, what you could do to reach out to the Asian community and also make space for the Asian community, and for us to actually work together. So because I believe solidarity could be a messy business, but we have to actually work together in order to understand each other, and also in order to really deal with what we share in common. So, and I think Canada is a country, but we all share all the opportunities and rights on this land. And this land is indigenous people's land. We are all settlers. So whether you are citizen or migrant workers, so we all suffer if we don't deal with it. So, and I think like this invitation is for everybody. So, and I want to thank the organizers. So by having this seminar, you're actually bridging the divide between community and academia. So I think this is a good example for us to really build solidarity. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think thank you for organizing this amazing panel. So Rick and Justin is my amazing mentor, have been helping, supporting whole movement, particularly when this issue not being recognized. And I think that is what we need, right? We need solidarity, we need friendship, we need support. Fighting against racism and other justice is not easy, but I think we need that. And also we also need to keep critically challenge ourselves, right? That whether in our activism, in our work, actually excluding other people, and particularly the intersectionality, that how our racism affect people so differently. So, and also when we keep talking about anti-racism and then how to address, and this is something Justin keeps saying, the systematic racism. That's the everyday people experience. That is something really, really important. And I think anti-policing last few years, like particularly last year, have like more and more people concerned, but still we are very limited to think police is only solution. And I think bringing more transformative justice perspective, learning about how can develop community support measure to address the issue violence we are facing, and learning about the story and resistance from other community, I think that is something very, very important. And again, just like I said at the very beginning, when we talk about anti-racism work, we cannot talk about it without address the classism, cannot talk about against the sexism, the homophobia, and also the policing. And we should not forget the murder. They are not only Asian, but they are the people who work in massage parlor. They are harmed by criminalization of sex work, and also the discrimination of massage parlor, and the over-policing and criminalization. So that is something need you to come together to fight against. Do not support the rape, do not support the rescue, and do not support the harm, like this harmful anti-trafficking initiative and policy. We need you to say loud against it with the informed by the community. And so we have petition, I keep declaration, ask you to sign, I keep sharing in the box. This is so important because now we have like 4,000 people have signed this declaration. So we really, really need to get more, because we need to show the politicians, so the government know that this community is having people behind them. Why they are being targeted is because people are silenced when they face the violence. The violence is not only the murder, the violence is from the state. So that is something need your help. So please, today, if you have like any message you feel inspired, please share with Twitter, Instagram, and social media, and please ask people to support the rally on Sunday, but also support our call. So our call mainly is like recognize sex work is work, support the full decriminalization of sex work, including third party, including client, fighting for status for all, fighting for the access with the fair policy, and most important is recognize sex work is work. So I cannot name all the demand. But one more thing is very important: stop the harm of the human trafficking. Do not conflate sex work and trafficking. So, like all demand, we need to continue to help and share. And looking forward to get together with you again. And so, get your support and learning from your view, and then have this solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was lovely, really meaningful, and I'm really energized. I'm hoping that we can take from this another breaking down of the institution, right? Like to kind of think through the communities that it's supposed to serve. I'm going to try to summarize, because there's so many amazing questions, but I want to kind of point to 3 summaries that maybe like we could all, if any of you would like to answer. So first, there's a question about the complexities of racism itself, right? Like that racism can appear as intra-community, right, between Asian communities. It can appear as shadism within our own communities, right, within Asian communities, but it also can appear as a kind of violence, right, again, from other people of color against Asians, for example, right, in the kind of ways of coverage around Black and South Asian folks have been like, you know, the people that have been documented, right, as like quote unquote perpetrators, right, in these kinds of Asian racism. And so the questions have been like, how do we deal with the complexities of that? So that's one, right? I'm sorry, I'm just going to combine them for the interest of time. The second one is really about youth, like, right, notions of engagement, right? There seems to be energy in the chat about what youth can do, like, right, and what are the ways that we can engage youth? You know, Ciro even had asked, like, you know, a question from Ciro had even asked, like, how do we volunteer? What can we do, right? And then the last question I think that I'm kind of sensing also is the kind of specificity of Asian racism itself, right? So what do we say, right, in a place, you know, this happens, I mean, I encounter this, where anti-Asian racism, they always say, oh, that's the US. It doesn't really happen in Canada, right? And so those are the kind of three questions, right? But I just thought, so the first one is kind of the complexity of racism, because it's not just white supremacy, right? That it actually kind of becomes a sort of relations with other people of color and within ourselves that can be fraught, right? And engagement for youth, and finally, kind of, what is the specificity of Canada? Right? So, yeah.
I don't know why I keep going first, but I guess we'll just. So I think like the solidarity piece. I think, you know, I'm very inspired by a lot of stuff going on in the States. I know, and this is where like the like, you know, like San Francisco, where we're seeing a lot of where it's like, okay, you know, like it's Asian community versus like, you know, oh, it's a black attacker, or like other people of color, right? So it's like really, and so the really conservative side has been pushing on this. Oh, okay, like, you know, it's like black people who are targeting Asian people, but then we know it's like it's systems of violence, right? And so I think, yeah, I think we have to fight back against that and really root it back in a systemic analysis, right? I don't think the systemic analysis helps at the immediate moment. And so, which is why I think a lot of the organizing on the ground, organizations like, you know, the Chinese Progressive Association in San Francisco, and, you know, many other great groups in the Bay Area have been doing, is like, how do we bring this back to like about like community and healing and systemic issues about racism and access to resources, right? I think that's a really important framing. About the instance in Markham, right? Like it feels like it's so timely, like kind of like, oh, like, you know, we like there's suddenly a lot of talk about anti-Asian racism, and then the police arrest this person, right? Like, so I think, like, as Elene mentioned, you know, how do we like make sure this isn't just about being used to fund more policing, right? And I think the more we are able to articulate the systemic issues, the more we are able to build a large left coalition, the better we will be able to ensure the narrative is not about more policing, but how do we make sure, you know, there's housing, there's jobs, there's resources, right? How do we look at the systemic roots of racism and talk about that in a effective manner, right? And I think when we do that, we can address, at least, you know, contest and make sure that's not the only narrative, right? It's just like, oh, it's like, you know, these other criminal racialized people who are doing this to us, right? We know that's not the case. As Elene said, you know, the state is, you know, like the capitalist state is, you know, the one who's doing the violence, right? And so about the youth, I think there's a lot of great organizing work around youth as well, right? I think how do we commit resources to that? Certainly, you know, we see great organizing initiatives in the US, and certainly in Canada, we can do more as well to train our youth and to build up our youth as organizers, as, you know, people who can engage in two languages, as people who can, you know, help bridge some of these challenges in our communities, right? And I think when we do that, we can do better work, right? And really, I think that's part of the contesting as well, right? Like, you know, when we build capacity amongst our youth, or amongst, like, you know, marginalized folks, we're better able to contest for like progressive power, right? And I think that's key, right? The last part, I think that's about the specific nature of the anti-Asian racism. Like, yeah, I think, you know, and obviously we never really talked about it today, but I think it's obviously rooted in the geopolitics of the new world that we live in, right? And how we address that, like, where we go from there. I think like we have to recognize that, you know, it's geopolitical, like it's a geopolitical contest, right? And so like, how do we fit in? Like, what are the challenges of that? What are the risks? I think that's just the reality, right? I certainly think we need to have more conversations around that within our community. But yeah, I think like it would be unfair to like not recognize that, and how big, you know, this, you know, like, you know, the growing tension. In some ways, it's like 9/11, right? You know, it's just like, but this time it's even more serious, because it's not just like, you know, it's not just like, oh, there's like some groups of terrorists, right? It's like, you know, state versus state, like competition, right? So how do we understand that? How do we articulate a progressive position from that? I think is going to be really key in ensuring like we're able to fight for a better world, right?
Very good questions. Thank you for the participants. I think like in terms of complexity, actually it also links to the specificity of anti-Asian racism, because unlike anti-Black racism, which is more about like the physical characteristics, so skin color. So, but when it comes to anti-Asian racism, the markers actually is multiple. So and a lot of them actually are very subtle. So especially like it could be cultural marker about like so-called the cultural narratives, like Asians are like that, and Western people are not the same. So and so the cultural marker is very subtle, and actually is really hard to actually name and actually point to. And also links to the immigration system, because the immigration system actually like draw like both the poor and also the educated and the richest like to our country. So like the settlement process actually is like K-shaped. So for people who are less educated or from less colonial countries like China, so and they tend to suffer more of the less economic and employment opportunities. So and those who actually came from the former British colonies like India or Hong Kong, so they would have the better equipment of language, and then because of the education recognition, they also like tend to actually have that upward mobile advantage, and that actually create like the notion of model minority myth. So that was used actually to actually silence people who actually like tend to be militant in our community, and also like create a division between racialized community. And they use us as an example to show like other racialized community, if the Asian community can actually make it, so and if you can't, that's your problem. So I think like the model minority myth has to actually link with the immigration system, and the immigration has been the major source of the growth of the Asian community. So and then the third one, I think Justin actually already pointed out, which is the geopolitical situation. With the whole emergence of like new Cold War against China. So and how we position ourselves here locally would actually also determined by the relationship between like the Western Empire and the Chinese Empire. So we are dealing with, we are stuck between the two empires. So that's why when we talk about like anti-Asian racism here and our resistance, and we have to actually like really realize the complexity of it, and also really make visible the invisible. Like the cultural narratives really bother me, and also like the immigration system, which is structural. So that's why when we deal with it, and we have to acknowledge both the cultural aspects, the structural aspects, and the global aspects of it. So it's not easy. So that's why I actually really hope the young generation, the younger activists in our community could actually lead us, because they are more informed with intersecting analysis, and they are also like with the energy. And I also want to like invite like the old guards, including myself, like stay open and be supportive to our younger activists, and let them lead the way. So that's why I think organizations like Butterfly and CCNC, they are good platform, and so as ACLA. So and I hope like when whoever, like whatever your age, especially the young activists, if you want to do something in the Asian community, like join us. So and we are open platform. So just contact us, and we could actually work together. And if you have specific project in mind, you could actually create your own project in our platform. So ECLA is an open platform. So, and I will invite whoever with any specific ideas to actually come to join us. And this is the only way for us to deal with the complexity of anti-Asian racism, because it's not a monolithic battle. We have to actually deal with it on multiple fronts. So more people, more diverse people could join us, the more and more equipped we are to deal with those complexity and specificity.
Yeah, and I think that is also very important. We need to critically examine the whiteness in our Asian community, particularly the racism we face, that how racism is so powerful that we need to take up a lot of whiteness to resist it. So that's like particularly we so visible to see classism play out. So, and I think that how we need to, maybe in the future, we need to have like more dialogue about that. But I think this is also a powerful piece that uphold and make the state continues the power and also make the racism continuous, because it's like our elite, our community leader, actually they are facing racism, but also like how the whiteness in the Asian community is play out and maintain that racism, right? Particularly by using like the Asian community itself. So, and other pieces, because here are so many academic, and so I think it's sometimes very challenging. Like we know that there's all a requirement of the academic, you know, but I think that we also need to aware how I think there's a lot of discussion about community-based research, how community is being used. We see actually so many harmful policy actually is done with very good intention. So for example, the language requirement of like a citizen actually is support by the research of like people have the language barrier, and so that the anti-trafficking policy not allow the people with do not have permanent residence, cannot work in sex industry, also is because there is the research talk about the vulnerability of people. So, and I think that we also need to know that one, we should not like keep exploiting the community. The other, we also need to know how our research being used, right? So that you may have very good intention. So, but if you do not work with the community, continues the advocacy work, all your research can be so powerful to harm the community. And so, and the last thing is really support the grassroots organizing. And so share your resources, share your power, and whatever way to support the grassroots organizing. And I think this is essential and important. And so, and last is sign our declaration, support sex work is work, support decriminalization of sex work, and stop the anti-trafficking rate. We need your support because this is not the mainstream perspective. And so, and we need your solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. First, I just wanted to say, you know, I am deeply moved by just how powerful everything you've said was, and the kind of work that you're doing, but also I want to echo everyone's chat, Q&A. People are very appreciative, and I think it's giving people a space to be with each other and to think with each other and to want to act together. Also, I'm really struck by the three of you really kind of talking about the way that knowledge is distributive, right? Like that knowledge and education and pedagogy is distributive, and we have to make an effort to balance the uneven distribution of these kinds of knowledge because they're also material. And Elene, I'm really struck by your real critique of research, right? Like I want to say this, you know, because in Canada, one of the things I've noticed is like Asian communities have not learned from our Black and Indigenous colleagues, right? Like who've actually claimed their knowledge to say, no, we have to write about ourselves. We have to write about ourselves. And that means that our community, we have to talk about our community from across levels of power, right? And we have to distribute that power. And I want to hope that like in this kind of discussion, we can claim some of that back, right? Like that actually our community, the Asian diaspora, we can speak about ourselves and we cannot be siloed, right, into these kinds of fields where monetary or material research is given to other people talking about us when they don't have the lived experience. So I think it's important for us to I just want to flag this because this is something that matters to me. And so again, I want to thank everyone for this like for all of the labor you're doing, and hoping that in the future we can continue to, you know, balance this, empower balance, right? That makes us like resource in many ways that we need to distribute and give, right? And so thank you. And on that note, I'd like to send it to Professor Choo to wrap us up.
Well, I just want to echo, thank you so much for staying with us and sharing with your insights, and for more than 200, 300 people who came to join us. I think we got a lot of answers and insights, but at the same time, we are still left with a lot of questions. But I hope the questions that we have now are better ones when we started an hour and a half ago. And so I just want to end by, really renewing our individual and institutional commitment to challenge anti-Asian racism and engage in the form of intersectional resistance that all of the panelists have shared. And I want to sincerely thank everyone who came to join us today. Thank you. We'll do this again.